Did you really think your daughter belongs here? The cruel words sliced through the air like a knife, shattering the soft music and cheerful chatter of the banquet hall. Gasps followed, then whispers, as eyes turned toward the source of the insult. At the center of it all stood Caroline, the millionaire's glamorous wife, her posture flawless, her smile sharp as a blade. Diamonds sparkled on her neck and ears, catching the chandelier's light, but none of them shone as brightly as the cruel satisfaction in her eyes. In front of her stood a little girl, no older than 10, her small hands gripping tightly onto her mother's fingers as though they were her only anchor. She wore a faded dress, the kind of outfit that screamed practicality rather than wealth. Her shoes were scuffed, her hair neatly tied back by her mother's care, but her wide eyes betrayed a mix of fear and humiliation. Her mother, Maria, froze in shock. She was a cleaner at the mansion, a woman who worked tirelessly in silence to make other people's lives comfortable. She had never asked for special treatment. Tonight, she had only come to do her job, to serve, to clean, to blend into the background as always. But she hadn't expected her daughter to become a target of ridicule. Alina, the little girl, blinked back tears. Her lips trembled as the wealthy guests around them chuckled at Caroline's remark. The laughter wasn't kind, it was sharp, mocking, the sort of laughter that makes a wound deeper. Caroline's friends hid their smirks behind champagne glasses, their jeweled bracelets clinking as they whispered to one another. Maria wanted to shield her daughter, to whisk her away from those piercing eyes, but she stood frozen. Years of being looked down upon had taught her silence. To speak up against the rich was to risk everything, her job, her home, her fragile stability. And yet, the ache in her chest was unbearable as she watched her daughter's spirit dim under the weight of those words. But what no one expected was the reaction of the man they all looked up to, the millionaire himself. Edward, Maria's employer and Caroline's husband, was a man of great wealth and influence. People often whispered about his fortune, about his empire, about the kind of power he held in his hands. Tonight, he stood at the other end of the hall, surrounded by business associates, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the vanity around him. Unlike Caroline, he never sought the spotlight. His strength wasn't in dazzling words or grand gestures but in the quiet way he commanded respect. As Caroline's voice echoed through the room, Edward's sharp eyes had already fixed on the scene. He saw the fear in Alina's face. He saw the humiliation in Maria's trembling shoulders. And he saw the smirk on his wife's lips. A smirk he had seen too many times before, a smirk that revealed her true heart. But before Edward acted, let's return to the beginning of the evening. It had all begun with a grand charity banquet, hosted in one of the city's most opulent halls. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, their light scattering across golden-framed mirrors. Musicians played violins in the corner, filling the air with soft, elegant melodies. Waiters glided smoothly between the guests, carrying silver trays of wine and delicacies. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted delicacies, a mix of extravagance and pride. The city's richest elites gathered here not only to donate but also to be seen. Women in glittering gowns and men in tailored suits filled the room, their laughter rising above the music, their conversations laced with boasts of business ventures and exotic travels. And in the middle of it all was Caroline. She loved nights like these, nights where every eye followed her, where compliments rained down like confetti, where she could flaunt her diamonds and her status like a crown. To her, life was a stage, and she was the star performer. Dressed in a breathtaking gown of deep sapphire blue, her hair styled into perfect waves, she walked across the room with practiced grace. People paused to admire, to greet, to flatter. She basked in it, her smile polished, her words rehearsed, her heart swelling with pride. Edward, however, was different. He stood quietly, speaking only when necessary, his gaze drifting often toward people who weren't in the spotlight. He noticed the staff rushing to keep things in order, the waiters sweating under the weight of trays, the cleaners silently making sure everything sparkled. He noticed the human side of the night that others ignored. But he kept his observations to himself, never drawing attention. It was during this time that Maria arrived. She had been called in to assist with small cleaning duties during the event, and since she couldn't leave her daughter home alone, she brought Alina along. She had hoped no one would notice the little girl if she stayed close, quiet, and respectful. But Alina's wide-eyed curiosity betrayed her. She looked around in awe at the chandeliers, the gowns, the glittering tables. It was a world so far removed from her own that she couldn't help but stare. That was when Caroline noticed. Like a hawk spotting prey, she zeroed in on the little girl. At first, it was a whisper to her friends, a cruel giggle disguised as a joke. But then, unable to resist the chance to humiliate someone beneath her, Caroline raised her voice. Her words struck hard, silencing the music in Alina's heart. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The laughter of the rich echoed like thunder, drowning out the quiet sob building in the little girl's chest. And in that silence, Edward's calm but steady footsteps began to move across the hall. Maria's heart pounded as whispers and chuckles spread across the hall. She wished she could sink into the floor, vanish, protect her daughter from the storm of cruel eyes. But her legs felt heavy, her throat dry, as though invisible chains held her in place. She had endured years of judgment in silence, but tonight was different. Tonight, it wasn't just her. Caroline had turned her cruelty onto Alina, the little girl Maria had worked so hard to protect. Caroline's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she walked closer, every step deliberate, every movement meant to draw attention. The crowd parted slightly, eager to witness the spectacle. She stopped directly in front of Alina, her gown shimmering under the golden light, her eyes glinting with arrogance. "Tell me, sweetheart," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "are you enjoying yourself here? Do you like being surrounded by all this beauty?" She gestured dramatically toward the chandeliers, the tables laden with food, the gowns that sparkled like jewels. Then she leaned in, her smile widening. "Or does it feel too much for you?" A few people chuckled, some covering their mouths in mock politeness, but their eyes shone with amusement. Alina clutched her mother's hand tighter, her tiny fingers digging into Maria's skin. She didn't answer, her lips pressed into a trembling line. Maria finally found her voice. "Please, ma'am," she whispered, her tone pleading but firm. "She's just a child. Leave her be." But Caroline was not the kind of woman to stop when she saw weakness, she thrived on it. Straightening, she tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, I didn't mean any harm," she said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "I'm only curious. After all, it's not every day that children of the staff mingle with the city's finest." The words were laced with venom, disguised as curiosity. Maria's cheeks burned, but she lowered her gaze, unwilling to escalate further. Alina, however, lifted her chin slightly, her wide eyes shining with a mixture of fear and quiet defiance. She had inherited her mother's strength, though small and fragile, and Caroline noticed it instantly. That faint spark of courage only fueled her desire to crush the child further. "So," Caroline continued, kneeling slightly to get closer to Alina's face, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" "Let me guess." Her eyes flicked to Maria, then back to the girl. "A cleaner, like your mommy?" The room erupted with laughter. Champagne glasses clinked as people whispered jokes, their voices cruel and careless. Some tried to hide their amusement, others openly smirked. Alina's face turned crimson. She shook her head slowly, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Caroline smirked triumphantly. "Ah, silence," she said with mock pity. "Well, perhaps that's best. Dreams are a dangerous thing when you don't know your place." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Maria's chest ached as though someone had driven a dagger straight through her heart. She wanted to scream, to tell Caroline that her daughter was worth more than all the jewels in the room combined, but years of survival instincts held her tongue. Speaking up against Caroline could mean losing her job, her only source of income. And without that, what future would Alina have? Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't let her daughter see her cry. She squeezed Alina's hand gently, silently trying to tell her, "Hold on, my love. Don't let their words break you." The crowd, sensing no resistance, began to drift into side conversations, though their laughter still lingered like smoke after a fire. Caroline, satisfied with her little performance, straightened and smoothed her gown. She looked around, expecting admiration for her wit, expecting her husband to step in and add his approval. But Edward hadn't moved. He stood at a distance, his expression unreadable, his gaze locked on his wife with quiet intensity. Maria glanced up at him for a brief moment, her eyes filled with shame and desperation. She wondered if he, too, would laugh at her daughter. She wondered if he, like the others, believed they didn't belong here. Alina tugged gently at her mother's dress. Her small voice finally broke the silence. "Mama," she whispered so softly only Maria could hear, "I don't want to be here anymore." The words shattered Maria's heart. This event that was supposed to be a night of service and survival had turned into a nightmare for her child. She wanted to run, to escape, to hide Alina from the cruelty of the world. But before she could move, Edward began to walk forward. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor with each step, steady and deliberate. The crowd's murmurs quieted as they noticed his approach. Caroline turned, her confident smile returning as she prepared to bask in her husband's approval. But what came next would shake the room, leaving everyone speechless. Edward stopped just a few feet away from his wife, his tall frame casting a shadow over the glittering floor. His presence carried weight, people instinctively straightened their backs, glasses lowered, whispers faded. All eyes turned to him, waiting to see if he would side with Caroline and continue the humiliation, or if something else was about to happen. Caroline flashed him her most dazzling smile, the kind she reserved for moments when she wanted applause. She placed a hand delicately on his arm and said, with a laugh that dripped with pride, "Darling, I was just having a little fun with the staff's daughter. Isn't she adorable?" She motioned toward Alina as though the little girl were nothing more than a pet on display. But Edward didn't smile. His dark eyes remained fixed on Alina, studying her trembling figure, the tears threatening to spill from her eyes, the way she tried so hard to stand tall despite the ridicule. His jaw tightened. The silence grew heavy. Finally, Edward crouched down, bringing himself to Alina's level. The entire room gasped. A millionaire, dressed in a custom-tailored suit, lowering himself in front of a cleaner's child? No one could believe it. Even Caroline's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. Edward's voice was calm but warm, carrying a depth that contrasted sharply with his wife's sharp tone. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. The little girl swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Alina." Edward nodded, offering a kind smile. "Alina. That's a beautiful name." He paused for a moment, making sure she met his gaze. "Tell me, Alina, what do you want to be when you grow up?" The question, so simple yet powerful, silenced the hall completely. Caroline's mocking words still hung in the air, but Edward had reframed them, turning cruelty into possibility. Alina hesitated, her small fingers clutching her mother's hand for strength. Then, with a trembling voice, she said, I want to be a doctor. So I can help people." The crowd stirred, murmurs rising like a wave. A child of a cleaner, daring to dream so big? To some, it sounded foolish. To others, it was inspiring. Edward's smile widened, his eyes shining with genuine admiration. "A doctor," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's a noble dream, Alina. And do you know what I think?" The girl blinked up at him, curiosity overcoming her fear. "What?" she whispered. "I think," Edward said firmly, his voice now carrying through the entire hall, that you can absolutely become a doctor. And anyone who tells you otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. A collective gasp rippled across the room. All eyes darted between Edward and Caroline, whose face had gone pale beneath her makeup. Maria's lips parted in shock. For years, she had prayed for someone, anyone, to see her daughter's worth. And now, the most powerful man in the room had done exactly that. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't from shame. Edward stood, his tall frame towering once more, and turned his gaze on Caroline. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a cold, steely intensity. His voice dropped, low and sharp, carrying authority that no one dared to challenge. "Caroline," he said slowly, "what exactly were you doing just now?" Caroline's eyes widened. She forced a laugh, waving her jeweled hand dismissively. "Darling, it was nothing. A harmless joke. You know how I am, I was only teasing." Edward's stare didn't soften. He took a step closer, his voice firm enough to make even the most arrogant guest in the hall sit straighter. "You call mocking a child a joke? You call belittling the daughter of a woman who works tirelessly every day to provide for her family, teasing?" The room fell into pin-drop silence. Caroline's face flushed crimson. She stammered, I didn't mean." Edward cut her off, his tone sharper now. "Enough." He turned to the crowd, his voice strong and commanding. "Every single person here heard what was said. And I'll make it very clear, in this home, in my presence, no child, no person, will ever be shamed for where they come from. Not by my wife. Not by anyone." Gasps and murmurs filled the air again, but this time, the energy was different. The mocking smiles had vanished, replaced by awe, respect, and even guilt. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing how quickly they had joined in Caroline's laughter. Caroline, humiliated, looked around desperately for support, but none came. Not even her closest friends dared to meet her eyes. She had expected Edward to stand proudly at her side, but instead, he had drawn a line in the sand, and left her standing on the wrong side of it. Alina looked up at Edward, her eyes wide with wonder. For the first time that night, a small smile tugged at her lips. Someone had defended her. Not just anyone, but the very man everyone else respected and feared. Maria squeezed her daughter's hand, her own heart swelling with gratitude. She had come into the banquet hall invisible, treated as less than nothing. But now, in front of the wealthiest and most powerful, her daughter's dignity had been restored. And yet, Edward wasn't finished. He turned back to Alina and crouched once more. "Alina," he said gently, "I want you to promise me something. Promise me you'll never let anyone make you feel small. You dream big, and you hold on to that dream. Because the truth is, people like you are the ones who change the world." The little girl nodded, her eyes shining with hope. "I promise," she whispered. The hall erupted, not with laughter this time, but with applause. It started slow, hesitant, then grew stronger, until the grand ballroom was filled with the sound of clapping hands. Some clapped out of respect for Edward, others out of admiration for the courage of a small girl. But no matter the reason, the message was clear, the room had shifted. And in that moment, Caroline's power crumbled. The applause echoed through the grand hall like thunder, but Caroline could hear nothing except the sound of her own heart hammering in her chest. Her cheeks burned, her palms grew clammy, and for the first time in years, she, Caroline, the untouchable queen of high society, felt exposed. She had built her reputation on charm and superiority, but in one evening, her husband had stripped that facade bare in front of everyone. Edward stood tall, letting the applause wash over the room before raising his hand slightly. The noise quieted, though the energy lingered in the air. His gaze swept across the sea of glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos, landing on the faces of those who had laughed along with Caroline's cruelty. Many avoided his eyes, guilt coloring their expressions. "Let tonight be a lesson to all of us," Edward declared, his voice deep and commanding. "We measure people not by their wealth, their clothes, or their status, but by their heart, their effort, and their dreams. Every single person deserves respect, especially the ones who work hardest, often without recognition." Heads bowed. Some guests nodded slowly, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to argue. Caroline tried to force a smile, hoping to salvage some dignity. "Darling, you're absolutely right," she said sweetly, her tone dripping with forced humility. "I only meant—" Edward cut her off with a sharp glance. "Enough, Caroline. I don't want excuses." Her lips snapped shut. The crowd's eyes darted back and forth between them, astonished by how coldly he had dismissed her. This was not the adoring husband who usually let his wife bask in the spotlight. Tonight, Caroline stood alone, her mask shattered. Edward turned back to Maria and Alina. For the first time in years, Maria felt truly seen, not as a cleaner, not as invisible staff, but as a mother and a human being. Her throat tightened with emotion as Edward addressed her directly. "Maria," he said firmly, "you've worked in this household with dedication and humility. I've noticed, even if I haven't always said it. Your sacrifices for your daughter are admirable. And tonight, I saw with my own eyes the strength you've passed on to her." Maria's eyes brimmed with tears. She opened her mouth to speak but could barely whisper, "Thank you, sir." Edward shook his head slightly. "No. Don't thank me. It is I who should thank you, for raising a daughter as brave as Alina." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Never had they heard a man of Edward's stature speak so highly of someone so far beneath their social rank. Then Edward did something that left the hall stunned. He turned to Alina, his expression softening. "You said you want to be a doctor. That's a noble dream. And I intend to make sure you have every opportunity to achieve it." Maria froze, disbelief etched across her face. "Sir." Edward smiled gently. "Starting tomorrow, I will personally fund Alina's education. The best schools, the best resources, whatever she needs. Money should never stand in the way of a child's future." The hall erupted once more, this time in genuine admiration. Guests whispered in awe, some clapped again, and even those who had laughed at Alina earlier now looked at her with respect. Alina's eyes widened in shock. She tugged at her mother's hand and whispered, "Mama, is he serious?" Maria knelt beside her daughter, her tears finally falling freely. "Yes, my love," she choked out. "He's serious." Alina turned back to Edward, her lips curling into the first true smile of the night. "Thank you, sir. I'll work really hard, I promise." Edward chuckled softly, his eyes shining. "That's all I ask." Meanwhile, Caroline stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Every word Edward spoke felt like a dagger twisting deeper into her pride. Not only had he publicly corrected her, but he had also elevated the very girl she had mocked. Caroline's friends avoided her gaze, their loyalty shifting silently toward Edward. For once, she wasn't the admired figure of envy, she was the villain in everyone's eyes. Edward didn't spare her another glance. Instead, he turned back to the crowd and lifted his glass. "Tonight, we raise a toast," he announced. "Not to wealth or power, but to the strength of dreams, and to those who dare to believe in them." The hall filled with the sound of clinking glasses and cheers. Maria, overwhelmed, held her daughter tightly, whispering a prayer of gratitude under her breath. For years, she had carried the weight of hopelessness, believing that her daughter's future would be limited by poverty. But now, everything had changed in the span of one night. And as Edward's voice echoed in the hall, it became clear to everyone present, true greatness wasn't in flaunting riches or mocking the less fortunate, it was in lifting others up. The banquet ended with applause still echoing in the grand hall, but for Caroline, the night was far from over. She stood silently in the corner, her glittering gown suddenly feeling heavy, her jewels meaningless. Once, she had been the star of such events, admired, envied, respected. But tonight, she was the cautionary tale, the woman who mocked a child and was silenced by her own husband. As the guests began to leave, many of them stopped to pat Alina on the head or exchange kind words with Maria. Some even apologized, ashamed of having laughed earlier. The shift was undeniable. The girl they once mocked now walked through the hall with her head held higher, and her mother, though still dressed in a simple uniform, radiated a quiet pride. Caroline tried to regain some of her dignity, forcing small smiles and polite nods, but whispers followed her like shadows. She heard snippets as people passed. How cruel, embarrassing. Edward was right to correct her. Each word stung more than the last. When the last guest had left and the music faded, Caroline approached Edward, her voice trembling. "Darling, you humiliated me in front of everyone. Do you realize what you've done?" Edward's eyes, calm but firm, met hers. "No, Caroline. You humiliated yourself. All I did was reveal what was already there." She flinched, his words cutting deeper than any public scolding. For the first time, she realized her husband no longer admired her charm, or perhaps he never had. He respected dignity, kindness, and strength, qualities she had failed to show. That night, Caroline's power in social circles crumbled. Invitations became fewer, whispers grew sharper, and the same women who once envied her now kept their distance. She had built her throne on pride, and pride was exactly what destroyed her. But for Maria and Alina, everything changed in the best way. Within days, true to his word, Edward arranged for Alina to transfer to one of the best schools in the city. He personally ensured she had tutors, books, and every resource she needed. When Maria tried to thank him again, Edward only shook his head. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank your daughter for daring to dream." Alina threw herself into her studies with newfound determination. Whenever the lessons became difficult, she remembered Edward's words, "People like you are the ones who change the world." Those words burned like fire in her heart, pushing her to keep going. Years passed, and the little girl who once stood trembling in a faded dress grew into a confident young woman in a white coat. Alina became the doctor she had once whispered about being, saving lives, touching hearts, and inspiring countless others with her journey. Patients admired not only her skill but also her compassion. The kind of compassion born from understanding hardship. Maria, now retired from cleaning, watched with pride as her daughter flourished. Every tear she had shed, every sacrifice she had made, had been worth it. The memory of that humiliating night at the banquet no longer brought pain, it reminded her of the turning point that had changed everything. And Edward? His respect for Alina only grew as he followed her progress from afar. He had not only defended her dignity but had invested in her future, proving that true wealth wasn't measured in money or jewels, but in how one used their power to uplift others. As for Caroline, her name became a ghost at gatherings. Though she still wore diamonds and gowns, they no longer dazzled anyone. People remembered her not for her beauty, but for her cruelty, and the night she was silenced by her husband's powerful stand for kindness. And so, the story of the cleaner's daughter became a lesson whispered across the city. A reminder that arrogance can shatter in a single moment, but kindness and courage can change a life forever. So the next time someone looks down on you, remember this: your worth isn't defined by your clothes, your job, or your status. It's defined by your heart, your dreams, and your courage to rise above cruelty. Because sometimes, the ones the world mocks are the very ones destined to shine the brightest.